Well, welcome to all of you for this very last panel of the day. It's been a very dense day so far. So I'm going to tell you, those of you who are not present yet, what we've been discussing so far. So we started out trying to define or understand what strategic autonomy means and how it is perceived by our Asian partners. Then we moved on to discuss critical minerals, economic coercion using critical minerals and semiconductors in particular. And then the very last panel will be discussing the global trade order based on everything that we've been hearing so far. So the point is to try to figure out what the world will look like in terms of global trade architecture in the coming years. And we will be using, of course, Asia as an example. And I guess Asia being one of the main trading partner of the EU, we will be also focusing on Asia-EU relation in this context. So everybody knows that the global trade architecture has been, well, under stress for quite some time, to say the least. It's been going through an area of turbulence, as people say, when you fly. And to be more specific, I would like to identify three major changes that have been occurring over the past few years and that really impact the global trade landscape quite deeply. Number one is, I think, the shift that we observe from a rules-based order to something looking like a power-led world. So this is, of course, a major change since we've been living in a rules-based trade order ever since the end of the Second World War. So everything was quite predictable. That was precisely the point of having a trade order, by the way. So everything was predictable, it was quite clear and stable. And this is no longer the case. The rules-based order is gone, at least the way we understood it so far. And this is a major, major change. Number two, we see today a rising connection between economics and security. Again, up until recently, we could disentangle these two areas. You were either discussing economics, trade, or you were discussing security. And these two areas could be discussed in silos. This is no longer the case. These two areas are deeply connected. And so this makes, again, a big, big difference in the way we approach the global trade order. The third change that I also would like to highlight is the fact that national resilience currently takes precedence, or tends to take precedence, over globally connected supply chains. So what each country is really concerned about is its own resilience and the concern about the stability or solidity, robustness of globally connected supply chains is put on the back burner, so to speak. So in this context, what can we expect? What next? What will the global trade order look like? This is what we will be discussing. And to that purpose, we have, I think, an excellent lineup of speakers. And I would like to highlight that this is a 100% female panel, which is not too often the case. Thank you. Well done. Okay, so by order of appearance on stage, so to speak, the first speaker will be Deborah Elms, to my immediate right. Deborah is currently the head of the trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation in Singapore. I won't list the many positions that Deborah has held in the past. We've known each other for 20 years almost. Yeah, something like that. The time when TPP was still under discussion. That was a long time ago. And Deborah at the time was fighting for TPP, and nobody believed that TPP would ever come into existence. And she ended up being right. Yeah, well, congratulations. But anyway, so Deborah is following today every step taken by Donald Trump, and she is posting that on her LinkedIn. and I would recommend you to follow her on LinkedIn. She is a precious source if you want to understand what's going on with Trump these days, which is not an easy thing. The second speaker is online, and I see her. She is definitely online. Mireya Solis, who is the director of the Center for Asia Policy Analysis at the Brookings Institution. We've been fighting for a long time to get Mireya participate in our events, and finally we got her, so I'm very happy with that. So she will be the second in line, and I'll explain in a minute what each of them will be discussing. And the third speaker is Joanna Szychowska. Did I get that right? Yes. She is the Director of Asia, Services and Digital Trade, Investment, Intellectual Property at the DG Trade in Brussels. So to address this topic about the global trade order, we will start, I guess, with you, Deborah, as I said. And the point for you, your task, is to provide a broad perspective of the future of the global trade order. You've been following the recent trade developments, as I said earlier, very, very closely. So based on your observations, could you perhaps help us understand how the regional and international trade architecture is being restructured, if at all? This is not an easy task, but what I expect from you is really to provide this broad perspective to begin with. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I'm very happy to be here. We've been talking about doing this for a long time, and I'm happy that it finally took place. Okay, so this is a tough question to answer, but I would say in general, the analogy that I've been giving to audiences, which I think makes sense, is that we've had 80 years of economic integration, cooperation, rules, norms, a set of policies of behavior that has governed, I'm looking at my audience, most of your working lifetimes, for most of the people in this room, and for many of you, your entire lifetimes. That was never, just to be clear, it was never a perfect system. It didn't solve all things, but it was nonetheless a very long-standing set of initiatives. So think of it as building some kind of, vase, piece of pottery. 80 years, we're decorating it. We're adding doodads, we're painting it, we're refashioning it in one way or another, so it just keeps sort of growing. And I would argue that on April 2nd of this year, that vase, which had been sort of slowly being pushed closer to the edge of the table, was comprehensively shoved on the floor by Donald Trump. And now we have in front of us shards of pottery on the ground. Now, that does not mean, just to be clear, and this is especially a problem in Asia, it doesn't mean the end of globalization. It doesn't mean the end of economic integration. It doesn't mean that we're not going to trade with one another. But it does mean that the form and the function of what that looks like is much more in dispute than it was. And we're at the very beginning stages of this. So we don't know where this is going to end. So I would say right now, we are not going, and this is, I think, is one key message. We are not going to rebuild that vase as it was. Vase is smashed, not going to rebuild it. But we don't know. Are we going to build one vase for the future, one kind of vessel? Are we going to build a long, big, flat platter in which we have less deep rules, but sort of broad rules? Are we going to build multiple vessels that we all sort of share? We don't know. And the process of getting from where we are now, broken shards of pottery on the ground, to where we're going to be is going to be long, difficult, and messy. So for some of you in the room, I see some nicely young people. You have an excellent career ahead of you because we will be spending, hopefully not 8 full decades building this up, but it will be a multi-year, potentially even multi-decade process of figuring out where do we go from here. So, you have a bright future ahead of you eventually because there'll be tons of stuff to do and certainly lots of research projects and so forth, PhDs, galore. So there's a lot of things that are coming ahead, but between now and then, it's going to be rough. There's no sort of sugarcoating this. This is going to be challenging. It's going to be difficult. All of the partners that were so instrumental in building that original vase are at a bit of loss and confusion over what does this mean. And then if we think about it, pivoting a bit towards Asia, if you're an export-led region and you now have shards of pottery on the ground, what happens? If we rebuild in a protectionist way or a more protectionist way, what happens to an export-led part of the world? And so part of the anxiety that is felt by governments, by companies, and even by individuals and individuals working in governments and working in companies is that uncertainty that's been unleashed by watching, again, all of that lifetime of experience that just shattered. Now, the bright spot, maybe I don't have to be quite so bright in France, I don't know. But in Asia, if you're not coming to the party with some kind of bright spot, people are uninterested, right? There has to be some silver lining. There has to be opportunities. There has to be some kind of win-win outcomes. That's sort of Asia. So I don't know whether you guys have that same sort of, win-win outcome, but at least let me just say there are some opportunities ahead, not the least of which is there were a ton of issues that are developing that have been stuck for a long time, either at the global level or even at the regional level, where we now have the potential to discuss them. It's everything from the digital world, where we have very few rules, to climate and trade connections, to potentially this sort of security, trade, economic nexus, to how are we going to get economic development going forward? I mean, there's a bunch of things that I could argue that are now potentially available for a dialogue and a discussion. And how we get there, the process by which we arrive at wherever we're headed, is going to be fraught and messy. And so the last sort of point that I'll just make before I wrap up this first version of this is that the easiest way to get where we're going, and the one that I think most governments in particular will latch on to, is let's look at what our architecture currently includes. What are the mechanisms that we have already built that we could adjust, we could add on to, we could connect up in some way, we could create something from things that already exist, rather than try to start from scratch. And so one of the reasons that I have sat in Asia for as long as I have, because I'm more than 20 years now in Singapore, is because this is a region in Asia that has a lot of alternative architectures already in place. So let me just briefly mention a few of them, and then I'm happy to hear from my fellow excellent panelists on your views on this. We have a few that I'm going to just highlight without meaning to dismiss anyone in particular, but we just came through summit season in Asia. Summit season for us involves a variety of leaders meetings, starting always with the ASEAN, Southeast Asian nation meetings. So that includes foreign ministers, economic ministers, ultimately with the leaders. ASEAN has its own integration agenda. At this last summit season, for example, ASEAN did a couple of things that I think are useful. It upgraded its own internal trade and goods agreement. Not a fabulous one, to be honest, but it's better than it was. They agreed on substantial conclusion on the Digital Economy Framework Agreement, or DEFA, which is the digital plan for ASEAN. I would love to be able to tell you it's going to be awesome, but I think it will be maybe awesome, but not implemented. So that's always a problem with ASEAN. But they also then work with their other dialogue partners, which is a key part of ASEAN as well. So ASEAN met with the European Union, with the Canadians, who are super keen to have an FTA with ASEAN, with all of their other dialogue partners. They upgraded for the third time the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement. So now we're in our third iteration of ASEAN-China. Then they met in the East Asia Summit, which I won't talk about because it's security, and I still try very hard not to get into the security discussion. But they also met in RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That's 15 countries in Asia: China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and all 10 members of ASEAN. So RCEP met, and RCEP had a couple of useful things that I will just highlight briefly, including a commitment, hallelujah, for an effective secretariat. This is my personal bugbear that we don't have these things in place, but we're about to get one maybe in RCEP, which is important because of commitment number 2, which was to accelerate accession process. We have at least 3 countries in line to join RCEP, including Hong Kong, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, keen to get into this regional trade agreement in Asia. And so I think that is very interesting, and you need a secretariat to help you with that. They also agreed that they would accelerate the process of implementation for RCEP and actually be meaningful about that. So I think some really interesting things took place on RCEP. We then had a pause on the Asian summit season in which the US and China met together and agreed on what I would describe as a partial temporary truce on some of the things that were causing problems between the two of them. And then we moved to the next part of Asian summit season, which is APEC. And we tend to overlook APEC often because APEC doesn't have any legally binding commitments. But I think what APEC does do is it brings everybody together, which is what we saw take place. And in particular, it gave countries in the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, an opportunity to meet, because most of them are still APEC members, but also to discuss what the future plans are for CPTPP with a commission meeting. We don't yet have a secretariat and we don't have the right system in place, but commission meeting in a month from now, a little over a month from now in Melbourne to discuss CPTPP secretariat, please. Japan, please, let's get our CPTPP secretariat up and running, to discuss how the CPTPP members are also going to expand, because we had additional countries step forward, and that list is really long now to join CPTPP, including with the addition now of Indonesia and Philippines, who have put in formal applications to join. That list is getting very long and very controversial. And then to accelerate discussions between CPTPP and the European Union, which I think will come up again a bit more. I think that is absolutely vital. Not that we're joining each other's agreement. I think that's too much, but at least to have some kind of how can we cooperate? How can we integrate more carefully? And to have a CPTPP ASEAN dialogue. I think that one's a little more challenging, but as more ASEAN members get into CPTPP or want to join CPTPP, that discussion becomes a lot easier. And so those are, I think, the building blocks that are going to be necessary going forward to deal with the broken pottery on the ground and figure out how can you start to build on what you already had, adjust it and adapt it as necessary, think creatively about solutions for inclusion of different kinds of issues, different membership categories. Oh, I should mention one more. Sorry, let me mention one more because I'm sure New Zealand would have a fit if I didn't, which is the FITP, a new agreement that is desperately in need of a new acronym. So FITP, I think, is the future of investment and trade partnership. It will also be launched at the end of November. The idea behind FITP is this is a new initiative to bring together small states. So there's 14 altogether. Key ones in my mind is New Zealand, Singapore, UAE, Uruguay, super interested. So it's a really unusual mix of countries. And the idea was to have small governments come together who are trade exposed to think about what kinds of projects could they deliver that would support integration, cooperation, et cetera, in a really diverse coalition. And so it's early days for FITP. I mention this here because I don't know whether anyone, especially on the corporate side, they're desperately looking for projects. So if anybody's got great ideas, this is the moment to recommend it to FITP, because you never know, your project could be the one that gets picked up and then becomes, who knows, the sort of one of the building blocks of whatever is the future of trade. So those are the sort of regional initiatives taking place in Asia. There's a couple of other smaller ones that I think we'll come back to, but let me stop there. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Deborah, for this kind of, sobering assessment, very pragmatic. Don't start out from scratch and try to build on the existing mechanisms, and there are plenty, indeed, in Asia. I must admit I had not heard about this FITP thing. That's a new one. I have some doubts, and I don't quite understand what they have in mind with this. But after all, if we look at the history of the TPP, it started out with 4 countries that were kind of, the coalition was very exotic. If I remember properly, it was Singapore, New Zealand, Chile, and Brunei. So very, very exotic. And after all, when they started talking to each other, they came up with a set of rules. And then when they started discussing financial issues, then all of a sudden the US got interested, if I'm not mistaken. And the US brought with it a number of other countries. And so this small group of 4 countries, 4 unexpected countries, morphed into a much larger group. And this much larger group ended up with 12 member states. Well, at the end of the day, the US withdrew, blah, blah, blah. I mean, everybody knows the story. But the initial steps were taken by this very, very funny group of 4 countries. So perhaps this FITP will become the same thing, could be. So nobody
I forgot
knows.
one more, but one more, an effort to sort of, bring the band back together. They also, those three countries, not Brunei this time, but Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile, just launched the green.
Yeah, green
what
something.
is the green something?
Yeah.
The idea is to do what they did in CPTPP and what they've done on digital with DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, to do the same thing for climate. So the band is back together, and they're hoping that they can push this sort of climate and trade initiative forward in the same kind of, slow, gradual building up of members in unusual places.
But what is interesting is that the dynamics is launched by a very, very small set of countries, and that may actually expand and then be turned into something that really looks like a big group, and that can actually structure a new global trade order. Who knows? So I thought it was quite an interesting point to make. Okay, so now I'll give the floor to Mireya, who will be, or who is expected at least, to talk to a large extent about Japan. Japan is an interesting case because Japan used to be until recently a very active player in terms of trade architecture in the region and beyond. I guess everybody remembers that Japan was the one who actually picked up the pieces of the TPP after the US withdrew from the partnership. And nobody actually at the time expected Japan to be so active. And so the question today, which I'm asking, is will Japan play again this kind of role? Will Japan be active in trying to reorganize, restructure, or rebuild some kind of order, global trade order or regional trade order? So will Japan be an active player again? I know that you wrote a book in 2024 calling Japan a quiet leader. So will Japan again engage in this quiet leadership that you identified? So what is expected from you now is to try to identify the role of Asian countries in this restructuring of a global trade order with a focus on Japan, because it is the country that you focus on usually. But if you want to, of course, talk about other Asian players, we are more than happy to listen to you. So Mireya, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Françoise. It's a pleasure to join all of you virtually. I very much hoped I could be in Paris, so look forward to another occasion. But thank you for allowing me to share some thoughts, and I will definitely talk about how Japan is navigating the current challenges. Before I do that, I would like to connect tariffs to broader foreign policy issues, because I think that there's certainly a lot happening, and the tariffs are restructuring the economic order, but they also have geopolitical implications. So I'll start with those broader comments and then talk about the US-Japan negotiation of a trade deal, and then what patterns can we identify Japan is adopting to deal with the current challenges. So let me start with this broad theme of tariffs and US foreign policy, because President Trump loves tariffs. He's been obsessed about trade deficits. That dates back 30, 40 years ago. There's nothing new. But the second term of the Trump administration has seen an escalation and expansion in the use of tariffs that we had not seen before. Clearly, there are certain objectives that are very dear to the president, such as the reduction of trade deficits, the promotion of US manufacturing, some sort of manufacturing renewal, and of course, something that's very much now the Supreme Court is listening to some cases that have to do about revenue collection. So these are, of course, important objectives. But I would argue that what we're seeing in the second Trump administration is different from the past, because there are now larger foreign policy objectives at play. And that puts us in very different ground. One is that we're beginning to see more and more a desire to use tariffs as a tool of sanctions, as a form of pressure, coercive diplomacy. If you think about how the second Trump administration launched into its tariff campaign earlier this year, well, the first tariffs were because of fentanyl flows and immigration flows. And the targets were Canada, Mexico, and China. Then we also have seen now President Trump threatened or imposed tariffs, say, on Brazil, because of objections about the judicial proceedings against former President Bolsonaro, and also against India because of its purchases of Russian oil. So again, the idea that he can do a lot of things with the tariffs, and he believes that he actually delivered a ceasefire in Southeast Asia by threatening tariffs. So that's, I think, an interesting dimension we should not lose sight of. The other element here is that more and more I see the Trump administration conceptualizing, making the case that tariffs are really a form of very broad burden sharing, and that it's important for the administration to go forward with this tariff campaign to buttress American leadership. And the argument is a little bit like as follows. The idea is that, the United States has for decades been the world leader and has provided public goods to the world in the form of, a reserve currency, the dollar, and in the form of the security umbrella. And the argument that now we hear from senior Trump administration officials is that the continuation of that role cannot continue unless there is some contribution, some payback, if you will, from the rest of the world. And how can others then make these contributions? Well, we've actually been given a menu of options. One is to accept to pay the higher tariffs without retaliation. Second, to open your own markets to U.S. products, open more your markets, or make pledges to buy American products, and certainly to invest more in the United States. And all these things should not come as a surprise, are the actual asks that we see in how the Trump administration is approaching the trade negotiations that follow the announcement of the reciprocal tariffs. So more generally, that tariffs are depicted as economic burden sharing, not just to address bilateral trade deficits, but to buttress support American influence in the world. I think that's also a new argument. We may have a lot of quarrels with it, but I think it helps us understand how this administration is connecting tariffs to broader geopolitical aims. And my last point on this broad set of comments is that, there's a lot of discussion as to what is the Trump doctrine of foreign policy. And I would not make the case that there is a grand strategy, a coherent strategy, but we begin to get hints. And I very much agree with the readout that Deborah provided of the recent summitry that happened in Asia. And if you look at, the itinerary, I think we begin to see glimpses of what I would call the Trump doctrine of economics first. And by this, I mean that it's very revealing that it all stops in the president's itinerary. The economic agenda was front and center. He accomplished some of these goals. He didn't accomplish everything. And certainly what he was after in each location was different. In Malaysia, President Trump secured deals with Malaysia and Cambodia, trade deals. That the most novel element to me was the adoption of some economic security provisions. And so what has happened is that these countries, in search for some predictability on the level of the tariff, which is now higher at 19%, have agreed to written commitments on mirroring U.S. policies on national security tariffs, on export controls, on investment screening. And they also have agreed to address the issue of unfair trading practices of companies from third countries that operate in their territory. And when we hear third countries, we all hear loud and clear China. So I think that's a very interesting set of developments and begins to tell you about how the administration is using tariff pressure to get these type of commitments. Vis-a-vis its allies in Northeast Asia, I think that the main concern has been to get pledges, commitments of massive investment funds to, again, create this manufacturing boom in advanced sectors in the United States. And when you combine the Japan and the Korean pledges, we're talking about $900 billion. That's no small change. And I think that that has also revealed a very strong preference of how the United States thinks of allies now making a contribution to the United States. And with Xi, that meeting that had everybody's attention, I think what we saw was actually the limits of US leverage, because it was clear that China can engage in this retaliatory dynamic like no one else can. China then used the announcement of the export controls on rare earths and critical minerals to put the US administration on the back foot. And I think what we saw on both sides, a desire to de-escalate and a truce, a 1-year truce. So you could say that they put the kitchen knives back on the drawer, but that the drawer is not under lock and key. Now, let me add a few comments on Japan, Joanne, to your, Françoise, to your question, sorry. I think that looking at the Japan case is interesting, not just because of what Japan can do, but also to get some clues as to how the United States, under the second Trump administration, deals with an ally. And what are the broad dynamics of how trade and security then interact in this new administration. So, when the Trump administration announced the reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd, and soon thereafter announced the auto tariffs based on national security arguments, the Prime Minister of Japan at the time, Mr. Ishiba, referred to this as a national crisis. And, Japan has been disappointed in the United States position on trade for a very long time. When the United States left the TPP, that was a huge blow to Japan, but it was, the missed opportunity to build something together in the region. What we're talking now with these tariffs is actual harm to the Japanese economy. And, Japanese exports will suffer. The auto industry is a key pillar of the Japanese economy. So that's why the national crisis language was invoked. And we should look at these negotiations as mostly and fundamentally a damage control exercise. And what they try to do is to reduce the tariffs to minimize damage, but also to prevent trade friction from clouding the overall relationship. Because in my view, President Trump does not compartmentalize. He does not separate the economics from the security. So if you want to have a good, stable relationship with the United States, you have to clear the hurdle of that trade negotiation. Very briefly, I would say that there are 3 main takeaways from that trade package. One is that there's no trade liberalization. That's not what this exercises or the negotiation with Japan was about. In the sense that the US tariff went higher. Yes, it was lowered from the 25% on April 2nd to 15%, but it does mean that the tariff is high from the status quo ante. And Japan did not lower any of its tariffs. So you don't have, so the end result is less free trade between the United States and Japan. Second, we have very familiar elements of managed trade. And here what Japan was able to do with the rice quota, the concession, was to expand very significantly the US share, 75%, at the expense of other suppliers. But it did not increase the quota. It did not lower the tariff out of quota. So again, it was about managing trade flows and agreeing to buy more agricultural products. But what is really novel here, and we're all still scratching our heads, is what I would refer to as a novel element of managed investments. And this $550 billion pledge, Japan made, I think, extraordinary commitments here. It agreed to this financing should be provided in the next 3.5 years. Once the projects have been identified, Japan has 45 days to provide the funding. And long term, after everything has been paid back, the 90% of the profits go to the United States. Now, Japan has put some safeguards, and I don't think that the US side wants, or certainly President Trump wants to hear what those safeguards are. First of all, that the majority of the funds will come through loans and loan guarantees. Second, that JBIC, the organization providing the brunt of the funding, has very clear criteria for the financing decisions. So therefore, these projects must be sound, must generate a profit, and must benefit Japan. But nevertheless, I think this is a very novel thing that is being now negotiated through these trade agreements. So there are many challenges ahead. One is that the implementation of the trade agreement will be complicated. Second, that it's harder to cooperate on economic security when you're deflecting tariff pressure. And there are many other elements here that complicate this. One is confusion about how the US is trying to advance or not technology competition with China, where the US-China truce of a few days ago will hold. And I'm happy to go into all of those elements in more detail. But the last point I would make is to the central question you posed, Francois, how Japan positioning itself. I think Japan is doing three main things, and there might be contradictions, but it's a very uncomfortable world we live in, and that's, I think, that the strategy that I see Tokyo pursuing. One is to embrace the alliance. Second, to invest in domestic capabilities. And third is to try to grow the rules-based trade coalition. So embrace the alliance. Why? Because alliance drift is very dangerous to Japan given the deteriorating security environment. And that's why I think that Tokyo has chosen pragmatism in negotiating this type of trade agreement. Second, building domestic capabilities. Maybe this is something that was discussed in the previous panel, but Japan has been very proactive in its economic security toolkit to try to address vulnerabilities that come from the tariffs, that come from Chinese economic coercion and overproduction practices. So I think that speaks to the strategic autonomy element of this conference in trying to become more capable in identifying risk, mitigating vulnerability, but also build up your strategic indispensability. And Japan tries to position itself now in advanced supply chains. And finally, I think that expand that rules-based coalition. And the question here is whether Japan will use CPTPP as a way to engage more broadly with the EU and with ASEAN and admit other members. I very much support Japan doing this, and I think that the beginning steps are taking place. There are very interesting ideas about how to advance EU-Japan cooperation in the context of the CPTPP. I agree with Deborah that we cannot talk marriage just yet, but maybe dating. And I think that there's some interesting ideas out there, for example, about a standstill agreement to at least make sure that we don't turn Trumpian, that countries don't begin to disobey willy-nilly WTO commitments and keep their bound tariffs. And I think just that would be a significant milestone. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Mireya, for this very comprehensive overview. And thanks for going back to Trump and trying to decipher what Trump is getting at with his strange policy. So that was very, very useful. And I think it was also useful to recall what Japan is trying to do in terms of developing its own capacities, because I think, as you rightly said, that it converges to a large extent with what the EU is trying to do, and that connects with what we will be hearing about the EU in a minute. So thank you for this presentation. So now let me give the floor to our third panelist, so Joanna. It makes things simpler for me if I call you by your first name. So the EU, of course, is quite tightly connected to Asia. It has a number of key Asian partners. And in this very rapidly changing context, and not always easy to understand context, what types of synergies is the EU building with its East Asian partners? Primarily China, Japan, Korea, because I think these are the countries that you are working on. And could you also perhaps explain what is the broader trade agenda of the EU in the coming years? Of course, connecting that to Asia, but more broadly also, if possible. So, Joanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Françoise, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a big challenge to be the last panel, and it's even a worse challenge to be the last speaker, because you have to keep everybody's attention and say things that no one has spoken about yet. So I will try my best not to repeat what you have heard already today. Many thanks for the invitation to this event, extremely interesting and extremely important. And I will indeed share with you a bit the perspective of the EU. There are very many things that Deborah was talking about, and Mireya, that I can agree with, and I maybe come back to it later on. And I will indeed cover a bigger picture and then zoom into the relations with Asia, either plurilateral or bilateral. But I was thinking where to start. And actually, I thought about the meeting and discussion on China that we had more or less a month ago with some.
Apparently, there is a problem with the mic, so perhaps you should hold it closer, or perhaps the mic doesn't.
Does this one work? Yes, it works. Okay, I'm not repeating my introduction. So I'm moving directly to the next point. So I was saying that I was thinking where to start, and I was reflecting on the meeting we had more or less a month ago on China, and some of the colleagues who are today in the audience were there. And this meeting happened to be on the day after China announced its 9th of October export controls. And the question was obviously, so how is the EU going to react? How important those controls are? No one knew 24 hours on. But then when we realized the implications of the export controls on rare earth and raw materials, I think we all get immensely surprised and scared, frankly speaking, because it was not just one more edition of export controls that we have heard of or learned about before. It is a type of a system that has a potential of restructuring value chains globally to the extent that is totally unprecedented. And if you look at the 4 weeks that followed, this Chinese initiative triggered a certain type of dynamics that maybe was lacking before. And maybe this is something that has a potential of bringing us to a little bit of a different place. So you see that even though the meeting between President Xi and President Trump was in the making, it actually happened a bit faster. You have seen a number of events happening in Southeast Asia, a number of agreements that have been concluded. And also on our end, that has very much galvanized the efforts to think harder and faster what should be the reaction. So I'm not drawing from that firm conclusions that therefore we know what the answer is. I think it was even a greater realization of the risks and assertiveness of China vis-a-vis the whole world than the 2nd of April announcement of President Trump. So if I were to characterize the moment we are in, I think this is by no means a time for complacency, even though there is a truce. We indeed have a window of opportunity to think a bit more calmly and reflect what would be the best way forward. But we should continue acting and thinking, what is it that we should be doing in order to avoid not only the escalation, but to basically build our own capacity in order to shelter ourselves and protect ourselves from this type of acts. So that is why I thought this is a good point to start with, and to then continue with what I would like to share with you, because I guess that is what will be guiding any type of work that EU will be doing with regard to the economic security, to multilateral trade, to how we want to position ourselves and with whom we want to do it. As Deborah said, the rules-based trade, as we know it, is gone. But I stress, as we know it. It doesn't mean that the rules-based trade is gone as such. I think that's an important point to stress, because there will be rules. And I would argue that these rules will be the rules of WTO 2.0. And this is something I will talk about in a moment. So it is just that there is no return to status quo ante, but there will be a new world order, and very difficult to predict what that would be, but certainly there will be new set of partnerships, rules, and that means that we have to very seriously rethink and rearrange the trade, and particularly for blocs such as EU, the success of which was built on trade to a large extent. This is almost an existential question. How do we want to position ourselves? How we want to keep on being open economy, at the same time, as we said it many times, not being naive. because this is not the way of doing trade as we had done it 5 or 10 years ago. I will not talk about economic security because I understand you covered it in earlier panels. But of course, what Mireya described, what Japan is doing is exactly very much what we are doing. So economic security based on the 3 pillars: protect, partner, and develop own capacity. I think this economic security has been with us, even if not in the letter, in the spirit, for a long time. Now we have just spelled out what it means, and we are working along these lines. But I will want to talk about the partner dimension, because this is where the interest of working with Asia comes into play. And I will start maybe with multilateral level. So coming back to WTO and how we see it, how we see the reform, or how we see the way forward. Well, WTO has been questioned for a long time. So what we have seen last summer probably accelerated or amplified the doubts and questions about this capacity to respond to the challenges, not only China, because frankly, we are talking about China and how much WTO is not fit for China, but US is not exactly happy with WTO, and neither is Brazil, nor is India. So it's not about just China not being captured by WTO system. It's much beyond. At the same time, I would say that those who revel in the demise of WTO system should maybe think and look into the risks of not having rules-based trade, because apart from the 4 countries that I mentioned, WTO is nevertheless 166 members organization. And this is not the organization for the richest and the most powerful. This is the organization for all the rest of the world. And if you look at the numbers, still 75% of global trade is based on WTO rules. So let's not forget there is a merit in having the network of international rules, but obviously we don't want this to continue being like this, because we know that neither negotiating function, not the dispute settlement, not the deliberation works. It just doesn't work. So what is it that we are thinking about? We would like to look at it, and when I say we, I'm speaking on behalf of my institution, of the Commission. We think that there is a short-term goal to preserve what matters and what is of value, and then together with those who are interested in preserving this multilateral system, to reflect what type of in-depth reform we needed. And that takes me to leadership and partnership, primarily with countries in Southeast Asia, because apart from wanting to have the US on board, we think that it is good to start with those who think alike, who basically consider that rules-based trade still matters. You mentioned CPTPP countries, and this is exactly our target group. This is where we see there is a lot of potential for coming together with joint ideas how to improve the system. And the idea would be indeed that for the ministerial conference that is taking place in March, we have a joined up blueprint for what types of reforms we expect from the multilateral system for it to become more efficient. Then on CPTPP, and I will move one layer down from multilateral cooperation to plurilateral, because that will be one of the options. We are not talking necessarily about having multilateral, but plurilateral agreements, because they are more flexible and they really make better sense, also original ones. So you mentioned that there is a discussion going on between CPTPP countries and the EU, and indeed this is the case. What I could tell you now is that we hope to find a political understanding on how to shape this cooperation in the coming months. We would have to understand what type of arrangements we can afford, because this is not a binding agreement. This is not about fully fledged trade agreement as we know it. This is about thinking what suits best the variety of countries that form CPTPP and us. So we are at the stage of reflecting what type of arrangements and which areas are of greatest interest to us. You mentioned digital, and indeed digital is something that we are considering very seriously. So our expectation would be that between now and end of November, we'll find sufficiently common ground so that we can start shaping more firmly the cooperation going forward. So that is point number one when it comes to plurilateral work that we see ahead of us. There is also another format or formula that we triggered and we started to engage on with Singapore, with South Korea, but also with Japan. And you mentioned this as well, which is digital cooperation and digital agreements. Of huge importance. Digital trade is complicated and no one likes to talk about digital trade because it's something very intangible, but has massive importance for all economies, for its own sake, but also because of where China stands on digital trade, particularly on flows of data. So we have entered into 3 agreements with the countries that I mentioned, and the intention is to roll out this type of agreements with the region, but also with other countries. And obviously, apart from this type of engagement that is pretty novel and targeted, we continue negotiating free trade agreements, which are much more robust. They take more time, but nevertheless, they still are a bedrock of our relations with partners along the world and across the world. And when it comes to Southeast Asia, we have on our agenda Philippines, Indonesia, that was just agreed, Malaysia. And well, if this is still something we can put under the same umbrella, we are in the very intensive stage of discussing with India. So we are not giving up on our traditional FTAs, but the signal is very clear. We are looking for alternatives, formulas for engagement that are better suited to the type of the partner in the country, to the type of the problem, and also that are much faster. I probably should add to this box the critical minerals partnerships, which are probably the most practical and the fastest way of working with interested partners. But all in all, we have extremely active and robust trade agenda across the world, with probably more emphasis on Southeast Asia. And I will not talk about China, even though you asked what synergies we are finding with China. I wonder whether this is the right question. I will not talk about China now. I'm happy to take it in the course of the discussion, but I would maybe finish with specifically with Japan and South Korea. Because Mireya said it. Mireya said that you observe certain increased dynamics and interest on the Japanese side to engage into discussions on economic security and to take relations beyond strictly economic. And I think this is what we have been seeing as well. That's why, apart from talking about the usual problems on trade and investment matters, so we have very extensive cooperation on economic security with Japan that has recently been politically upgraded, and we are bracing for the new edition of discussions on economic security next year. And we are also bracing for exactly the same type of exchanges with South Korea. So this is to say that as much as we cherish our economic free trade agreements and our economic and trade relations, which are and remain of high importance, we see that the pendulum has shifted. And what is really at the heart of our cooperation today, and what will be the heart of the cooperation, are any matters related to economic security, whatever is the right way to call it. It's about thinking how to protect ourselves, how to react if it's needed to react, and there is a strong need to react, and finally with whom to cooperate. So I will stop here, and anything on China, happy to take in the course of the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joanna. I think, I mean, you made a very good point saying that this is no time for complacency. And I think that the truce that has been reached by the US and China, I don't even think that it's a truce, honestly. It's just a pause. It's just, well, they agreed not to go on with, you know, some kind of aggressive behaviors. So this is no time for complacency, yes, but this is definitely a time to try to get our act together. And this is no easy thing, but it's good. It's a good thing already if the EU is really aware of this urgency. So that's an interesting point that you made. Well, perhaps I would like to get the reactions of our two speakers to what you said about the WTO, because you are the only one mentioning the WTO, and you sounded relatively positive about the WTO. Yeah, well, first thing, somebody has to be positive, that's right. And second thing, I would tend to agree with you that WTO is not perfect, but what if WTO did not exist? And if you look at the reality on the ground, it's true also that, yeah, most of the trade still takes place under WTO rules. So after all, WTO is not all that bad. It's true that the dispute settlement mechanism is blocked, it's stalled, it's been there, it's been stalled for forever, it seems, I mean, for a long time at least. So I would like to have the reactions both from Mireya and Deborah about the chance that the WTO may, well, have a new life or may get resurrected one way or the other. So what do you think? Do you think that there is still some place for WTO, that there is still a role for WTO in organizing trade, or should we think about another form of WTO? Deborah, perhaps first, and then Mireya, if you have something to add to that.
No, I think there is a role for the WTO. And in particular, I always think about a lot of these trade agreements as going to a dance, you know, and for lots of places there are dance partners for you, which is great. So if you're in ASEAN, there's a lot of dance partners because you're a member of ASEAN. You know, if you're part of the European Union, you have dance partners within the EU and then with others. If you're not in a functional region though, you're in trouble. So think about Bangladesh as an example, right? So they're in a part of the world that doesn't dance well together. And they don't have a lot of others who are begging Bangladesh to join them for a variety of reasons. So what are they supposed to do? You know, if the WTO goes down, then they're a real disadvantage, right? So we have a developing economy that is about to graduate out of the LDC status into just developing economy status, which is great. Testament to a lot of effort on the part of Bangladesh to move in the direction of further development to support economic integration, supply chains, et cetera. But if they don't have the WTO, then they can be discriminated against at any time. You know, sort of have the Trumpian thing done to them all the time by everyone. You know, that creates major problems and will be very difficult for them going forward. So I think we do need a WTO that is functional, especially on behalf of a place like Bangladesh, which desperately needs to have some kind of globally agreed upon rules and arrangements. But it's difficult because the WTO itself is really a dysfunctional institution. Though that doesn't mean I don't think, you know, sort of kick it to the curb and start over again, because that I think is going to be to try to get 166 people. We made a video when I started at the Hinrich Foundation on what does it take to get 166 people to order lunch. So imagine if there were 160, well, at the time there's 164, you had to order lunch and you all had to agree on it, right? Because that's consensus principle of the WTO. If you had to agree on what was lunch, where you were going to eat, and you got one menu item, like how long would it take to get lunch ordered? It would be forever. It's kind of a miracle, really, that we've gotten this far in the WTO as it is. But what you don't want to do is start over, right? And get 166 around the table and then say, let's order lunch. I mean, forget it. We'll never eat. So I think you want to build on what you have. But I think you also want to think creatively about alternatives. And it's that sort of, in a way, healthy competition between the global rules-based system that we have and these other arrangements, whether they're regional arrangements or sector-specific arrangements. Maybe that's what you need in order to eventually come back to the WTO. But certainly for developing countries in particular, you need the WTO to function. And for companies, you really need the WTO to function because there's a lot of things that are so much easier if they're just globally agreed upon rules, including digital, including potentially subsidies, including climate. I mean, there's a bunch of, you know, things for which companies would say, please don't give me a plethora of different kinds of rules or a plethora of different kinds of rules of origin or rules around services, commitments, et cetera. Give me one, and then I'll make sure that I build my systems to fit that. So much easier for firms. But it is going to be tough to get from where we are now with the WTO to where we want to be, because as you have very helpfully reminded us, there are a number of real obstacle countries to getting any kind of lunch ordered in the WTO anytime soon. And so I think I personally would like to say this is a great crisis. Let's use this to get folks who have been obstructionist forever to quit being so obstructionist about things that don't matter anymore and move on to real problems. But unfortunately, they're going to continue likely to be obstructionist in the same old way. And so, you know, hopefully, as we get to this ministerial for the WTO that comes up in March, we could put some new issues on the table, or at least get a little bit of movement, and at least maybe have different people blocking for different reasons, and maybe some would sit down. I don't know. So there's an opportunity here that's crucial, and I do hope that we seize that moment. But I'm worried that WTO being WTO, they'll sort of say, well, you know, we might not get it done at this ministerial, but we'll do it at the next ministerial. And if you say that to a company, forget it, we're not going to do it at this ministerial, but 2.5 years from now, we'll get to the thing that you might possibly want to care about. I mean, a firm they've left the room, right? They don't have that kind of timeline. So it would be nice if governments would get the same kind of urgency behind them that I think is important for companies.
Mireya, want to add something?
Sure, very much agree with that. You know, I would just say that this is one of the most severe crises I think that the multilateral trading system is facing. At the same time, it's showing us why the multilateral trading system remains so needed, so fundamental. You know, I think that China, with its recent movement on the rare earth controls, as Joanna was making reference to, I think it shook everybody because, again, these shows that there can be these supply chains could be seized up and that everybody is vulnerable. And before that, the United States, when it launched its reciprocal tariffs, I think that in many ways stepped out of the norms of the WTO, first because it pushed aside all the bound tariff commitments, but also because it did away with the non-discrimination principle. But interestingly, even having done so, the United States has not given back its membership card, right? It still remains in the WTO, which means that it still sees some value. And at a time when we don't know the terrain we are stepping on, that things can change on a dime and the rules can shift because of the actions of great powers, or as Deborah was saying, the WTO also has suffered from obstructionist states, not just the actions of the bigger economies. I think that everybody's aware that if we lose what is essential, which is those bound tariffs, those predictability levels, then we're not going to have the same level of trade, investment, development, and everyone will suffer. And I would also make the case that there are still many countries who are avid multilateralists in Asia and certainly in Europe. And the WTO non-discrimination principle not only influences, shapes their trade policies, but also their economic security practices. For example, Japan, when it drafted its export controls, it does so with an non-discrimination. It calls out a dangerous behavior, but does not single out a specific country. And I think that sometimes has created some frustration in coordinating with the United States, but it shows how much these countries, these actors still value operating in a non-discriminatory environment. So I think that, yes, time is tough. I don't have good recipe to reform the WTO, but in many ways we're being reminded day by day of why it remains essential.
Yeah, thank you, Mireya, for reminding us that the WTO is about principles, and that a number of countries still believe in these principles. So that's a very good thing. And interestingly, I think it's also very interesting to note that the US has not left the WTO. I mean, they threatened, but they have not. So apparently they see some value in this organization. Just one little comment about what you said, Deborah, about the ordering lunch. The problem, I think, with the WTO is that the lunch has been ordered a long time ago, and a number of countries had to join lunch without having a say in the choice. And that was, I think, the big problem that was perceived by the developing world after the Uruguay round, which was supposed to be a development round, and it didn't turn out to be a developing ground. So that was really the problem. I think the analogy with the lunch ordering is quite good. But if you go to a restaurant, the lunch has already been ordered and you simply have to join, you may not be too happy with that. And that's really a problem. Anyway, I mean, I guess nobody has the solution.
If I come back on the development thing, I would say, again, opportunity for new thinking, because the development path that we used to suggest was important may not be the same development path that we're going to have in the future. So there are many things that keep me awake at night these days. But one that does also worry me is what happens if the manufacturing supply chains are increasingly captured by a very small number of countries. What happens to manufacturing and jobs that are in those original, that pathway? The ladder, at least in your head, was agriculture to manufacturing to services. What happens if the manufacturing rungs on the ladder are mostly gone? And then what happens is, if that wasn't stressful enough, what happens on the services supply chain when AI rips through and takes out jobs? So how are we going to get growth and economic development when many of the primary mechanisms that we have relied on for a very long time to deliver jobs are gone, or at least are very fundamentally different, or employ a very small number of people? So I think the agenda, even on development, the agenda that we had in the WTO in 2001, when they originally launched the Doha Development Round, and I know some of you in the room weren't even born in 2001, that's how long this has been sitting there. I would argue that that agenda itself also needs to be badly updated, right? We can't just sort of say, well, the things that we cared about back in 2001 are still the priorities, without relooking at what those priorities are. Why are they still our priorities? And if not, what should we put on the agenda? And how are we going to get growth and economic development to be spread more evenly in the world that we have ahead of us? And so I would say it's not just that the lunch was ordered, it's that what we thought of as lunch might also be changing too. So again, like, opportunity, great, let's rethink this, but challenging, because it means that you have to sort of take a lot of what you thought was going to be the conversations you were having and sort of throw that out and start afresh. And that's just hard for everybody.
Okay, thank you. Any reaction, Joanna, about what has been said before I open the floor to questions?
I was just thinking about the question of jobs and what are the risks and how we handle the risks in this very different world, and with the degree of unpredictability that we are all facing. You are very right that these risks are probably more profound today than they were some time ago. If you think about WTO and about opportunities that this organization, or what it does, offers for developing countries, we have one notable example of plurilateral agreement on investment facilitation for development, which is a very good tool for all developing countries, with a number of opportunities that are related to this agreement, which is paradoxically blocked by one of the developing countries. So you may ask the question, what all this is all about, right? But then on the maybe more positive note, I was thinking about what will be the consequence of reorganization of the trade flows, but also the protect policy. Let's imagine that what the US has done with closing its market towards certain products from China is coupled by similar steps taken by the EU or by any other trading bloc. It is also an opportunity for many other countries to actually step into this production manufacturing that would not come from China anymore, but that will allow them to develop their economies. So this is a long shot, but I'm only trying to anticipate that not everything is fundamentally, or should be fundamentally wrong in a longer period. I think what is the difficult element to integrate is this transition period between now and something different that will emerge. Because you said it yourself, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be complex, it's going to be very painful, and it's going to be very costly. But I think if you create certain perspective, if you include the costs of retaliation or of closure of the markets or reconfiguration of the supply chains, but understanding that there might be an opportunity if indeed there's a different setup for the international trade, I think that can create a bit of a breathing space and a bit of a more positive thinking about the transition we are in. For the moment, I believe we are still at a stage where we are mobilizing ourselves and understanding exactly where we are. And we are not exactly at the point where we would like to act in a concerted manner with a clear perspective of what's coming next. So justice.
Thank you, but it sounded a little bit positive. Deborah, you want to add something? I see you.
I don't know if you're going to be able to. I appreciate the idea. Let's not act until we're quite positive on what we want to accomplish and how we want to get there. And we've thought about all the risks and the opportunities. I'm not sure the world lets you do that. I think the world requires you to make decisions in an incremental way, dealing a little bit with today. Of course, please let some long-term thinking besides just short-term responses, but you have to do both. And the idea that you could sort of wait until the perfect opportunity hits, not that I'm suggesting that that's what you said, but I do hear this often from governments, which is like, we're not going to do anything until we're absolutely positive we've thought about all of the possible risks and opportunities. And then I think it's too late. So I think there has to be some flexibility shown by governments in particular, because the timeline cannot be forever. It has to be, we have to make some decisions now, even if they turn out to be problematic. We can't just do nothing for a very long period of time and study the problem endlessly.
Right. So let me open the floor to questions. So, I see a number of hands raised. So, yeah. So at the very back first. So can you please introduce yourself, then ask your question relatively briefly.
Suzuki from the Jacques Delors Institute here in Paris. I have a relatively concrete question in terms of how like-minded countries, be it EU and CPTPP or others, can cooperate for MC40. So one way to stick with your lunch metaphor is to say, okay, you know, just people that want to order the vegetarian option get together, right? It is a plurilateral, which would have to be an Annex 4 agreement in WTO terms. But there are a couple of countries that have been blocking it, and this is not China, this is not the US, but it's India, it's South Africa, Turkey. So how quite concretely can we go forward with all these new trade issues at the WTO, maybe outside of the Annex 4, to bypass these while keeping the legitimacy of the organization? And maybe relatedly, everybody is a sinner now in terms of the breaching GATT Article 24, right? Japan was actually the first under the Trump 1 administration to conclude a sectoral agreement that eventually was supposed to become a full trade agreement. It's never going to happen. I applaud that the Commission has been quite clear now to say, okay, we are in breach of Article 24, the way that it stands, the Turnberry deal. But how do we reconcile this with WTO terms? You mentioned a standstill agreement, but do you also consider a WTO waiver a politically realistic possibility? Thank you.
Good question, tough question. Yeah, there is another hand at the back. Yeah, okay.
Hi, I'm Shang Yi, and I'm from Sciences Po, majoring in international security. I have a specific question regarding the de-risking process with China. So we have seen the outflux of certain factories from China, but it seems to have been concentrated in some, say, clothing and let's say less innovative industries. We don't seem to have seen the similar trends in terms of semiconductors and AI industries. Meanwhile, there have been analysis showing that if the production were to be localized in Europe, the cost would be up for, say, around 35%. So my question for you is that given the current, say, the von der Leyen administration has been constantly calling for de-risking, what sort of policies do you think that the European institutions should be enacting or to, say, help the enterprises to face this current increase of cost and meanwhile as to maintain their, say, profit or their investment in innovation to keep the, say, competitiveness of Europe in this current round of trade disputes and conflicts? Yeah.
Thank you. So that was a question to you, Joanna, I'm afraid. Okay, there was a third hand. Yeah.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe Long, consultant. I have two questions. One for Deborah about the partnership, regional partnership. You mentioned the 15 countries, including China, so it's a big elephant in the room. So what is your forecast about this future of this partnership? Because China is developing industry very fast and innovation very fast. So will it be a kind of backyard for China? What is your perspective on that? And question two for Joanna is about coming back to Europe and the stakes we have related to the Draghi and later report. We know that we have to move. So what is the rationale when dealing with India, Indonesia, Malaysia? All these trade agreements are coming in and are negotiated now. So this is bilateral, but how do you see the future content of this agreement and how it will help our competitiveness? Thank you.
Okay, so let's start with the MC40, WTO. No, I think that's you, Deborah, and perhaps Mireya, if you want to add something. That's the first question by Nicolas.
Yeah, I know, that's a tough one. I don't really have an answer. I'm sorry to say, I don't really have an answer. If I had one, I would be doing probably better. I think the problem is that because of the way the WTO is structured, you can't get anything done without consensus, but because you need consensus, you can't make a change. And so how do we get around that fundamental problem? I think we have to be a bit more creative. Now, this is not going to win me a lot of friends, but it strikes me that you could just, in a way, sort of pull a Trumpian maneuver and just declare this is how this is going to be, and you move forward and see what happens. I mean, I guess I'm open to suggestions for new approaches. And if there was ever a moment when you should be able to do new approaches, it ought to be now. So I would say potentially just make it happen. And those countries that recognize that this is the action you move ahead, and if you can't, then I suppose you move it outside of the WTO, but that is not the best option. That would be the sort of second best or worse outcome. And so, I think trying to get agreements done, you aim for consensus. If you can't get consensus, you move ahead. Otherwise, we're never going to get anywhere. And so, I mean, I think that is a real challenge for the way the WTO operates. But I don't see how you get rid of consensus while you have consensus as the rule, because the folks who love it will continue to block it, I'm assuming. And so that's, hence the need for these other kinds of pressure points, maybe, again, EU, CPTPP. And there on the practical side, if I could just give my practical suggestion for this, again, I'm with Mireya. We're not prepared to do a marriage, but what could we do? I think it would be really important, although this sounds very modest, it's super important. You got 39 governments in the room, potentially. You get them together in the room, one. Then you say, trade matters. Trade matters, openness matters. We think that's important. And as the 39 of us, we will not impose new restrictions on trade with one another. I think that's incredibly valuable. At this time in which we could potentially be throwing flames at one another, let's at least try not to do that among the same folks with the same kind of thinking. And then you agree after that to discuss other mechanisms for cooperation. So you start by actually getting in the same room together. Trade matters. We're going to stay open. We're going to work together on not damaging each other's economy. And we're going to work on areas of the future, whatever that happens to be. And I would suggest, for me personally, it would be sort of digital. The elements of CPTPP that were a little underdeveloped at the time, CPTPP finished in 2014. So, digital, clearly. Something climate, I think, would be very interesting, not necessarily in the way we used to do it, but as sort of new ways of doing this. And then you could discuss, I don't know, resilient supply chains. You could come up with all kinds of things that you think are relevant to put onto a potential CPTPP EU future cooperative conversation discussion.
Mireya, do you want to add something on that?
Yes, thank you. I like the phrase was used that now everybody's a sinner, and that's very much true. But it's a kind of complex and uncomfortable world that we live in, right? And I think that the way, these governments, and the case of Japan was mentioned, are having to navigate competing pressures. One is, of course, to make sure that their actions don't end up undermining the WTO, and many of these regional, but certainly the bilateral trade agreements are going to come short of the standard that's acceptable for the WTO to have some kind of preferential trade deal. But they're also dealing with economic harm from higher tariffs that if they don't agree to negotiate, and alliance drift in a way that would leave them, exposed in a very dangerous world. So it's going to be a world of very uncomfortable compromises that they're going to be addressing, and I think that explains the approach to the trade negotiation with the U.S. It's not going to be a WTO first approach, but trying to as much as possible, do less harm, or try to minimize the harm. And I saw this, for example, in the most recent negotiation between the United States and Japan, talking to folks in Tokyo about the thinking for how they were approaching this negotiation. To me, one of the interesting points I heard is that one of the reasons Japan did not consider reducing tariffs in this trade negotiation is that that would be WTO inconsistent. And therefore, they had to look for the investment fund or for other concessions that would placate the demands from the U.S. side without putting on the table tariff reduction. They were not going to bring this type of agreement to the Diet for ratification, thinking also about, so in their mind that made it easier to be WTO compliant. It also means that you end up with more informal agreements, right? Because they're not ratified in the Diet. And there's been a discussion in Japanese policy circles as to where the trade deal with the U.S., is it better to have it in black and white codified, or better to leave it, in fact sheets and subject to interpretation? And, there are arguments to be made for both cases, but I think it's also because of this need to not to be telegraphing to the world that you have indeed made these commitments that may come short of WTO rules, but that are essential also for Japan to make sure its economy stays in good track and it doesn't lose the support of its security guarantor.
Okay, so second question was about de-risking. So it's for you, Joanna, obviously.
Risky task, huh? Okay, I will not talk about WTO, even though I was tempted to comment still on your questions, but that we can do after. Maybe on the de-risking. And if you allow me, I will take the two questions together because they actually relate to the same problem. And this is about competitiveness, EU competitiveness. And I'm very glad that you are bringing this dimension into the discussion that we are having now, because we are talking about trade. But it will be a very wrong and limiting perspective to talk about trade and what we do on the trade side without bringing into the equation what's happening on the internal side of everybody's economies. So it's not just about the EU, it's about anyone else. And on this, I think it would be wrong to believe that with trade measures or with trade agreements, you will solve internal problems, or that your industrial policy, for that matter, is a remedy to all the problems that are there on the external side. I would even say that wrongly conceived industrial policy, and we have seen several examples recently, is a source of many problems in the external, on the external side. So I think we are, it's a high time that we were making this equation of bringing the two elements to the equation, external and internal, with even more emphasis on what's happening on internal markets, on industrial policy that we are about to develop. And maybe there are some lessons to be learned from the others, not to repeat the same mistake. Then on the angle that you have chosen to ask the question, how do the bilateral agreements that we are negotiating fit into the concept of boosting competitiveness? I was wondering for the moment whether this is a provocative question or not. I take it as nevertheless an innocent one. I think the bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements, they just contribute. They are not answers to all the problems that we face. They contribute to enhancing the competitiveness, they create jobs, they create growth. But there is maybe a different way we should be looking at bilateral agreements, or any agreements for that matter. Typically, discussion in many countries in the EU, when we talk about bilateral agreements, boils down to the value of tariffs and what products will come or will be exported. And this is very important. Don't get me wrong. We shouldn't be underestimating the value of the markets that will be opened with Mercosur, with Mexico, with Indonesia, or whatever else is on our negotiating agenda. That is extremely important, and particularly important in times where we have to look for alternatives because some other markets are not available. But I would say that the right way of looking into the agreements that we are negotiating or concluding is not just through the value of the tariff, but what guarantees in terms of security and diversification that such agreements offer. And the best example that I can think of are the raw materials, because we need them very badly. And the countries that we have been discussing these agreements recently, they are very rich in raw materials, and we need them. We need them to diversify from 30% of dependency on graphite or 40% of nickel in China or any other raw material. And this is what Brazil, what Chile, and what some others actually have on offer. So I think there's more strategic take that is related to our thinking about any bilateral or multilateral agreement. And that is indeed, seen from that perspective, this is certainly an important contributor to enhancing the competitiveness. Now, the question that you asked is related, but it's a bit of a different take in